The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he thought would be another ordinary day. As a senior guard with 15 years of service to the royal family, he had witnessed countless moments of palace life, from grand state dinners to quiet family gatherings. But nothing had prepared him for what he would see on this particular Tuesday in March. James had been assigned to the East Wing corridor, a section of the palace that typically saw little activity during the week. The ornate hallways, lined with centuries-old portraits and Persian rugs, usually echoed only with the soft footsteps of housekeeping staff. Today felt different somehow. Though James couldn't put his finger on why. At precisely 9:30 in the morning, James heard the distinctive sound of heels clicking against the marble floor. He straightened his posture and glanced down the hallway to see a familiar figure approaching. Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, walked purposefully toward him, her auburn hair catching the light from the tall windows. She wore a navy blue coat and carried a small leather handbag. Looking every bit the composed royal she had once been, James felt a surge of surprise. According to his briefing sheet, no members of the Sussex family were scheduled to be at Windsor Castle today. In fact, since their move to California and subsequent stepping back from royal duties, their visits to the UK had become increasingly rare and heavily coordinated affairs. Yet here she was, walking through the palace halls as if she had never left. "Good morning, James," Meghan said with a warm smile as she approached his position. Her American accent still carried traces of the polished British pronunciation she had developed during her time as a working royal. "Your Royal Highness," James replied with a respectful nod, though he felt confused about the proper protocol. Since stepping back from royal duties, the Sussex family's titles had become a subject of much discussion and debate. "Please." "Just Meghan is fine," she said, her voice carrying a hint of something James couldn't quite identify. Was it nervousness? Determination? "I'm here to see someone, and I'd appreciate your discretion about my visit." James nodded, though his training kicked in automatically. All royal movements were supposed to be logged and reported, especially unscheduled ones. But something in Meghan's expression made him hesitate. She had always been kind to the palace staff, remembered their names, and asked about their families. Unlike some members of the royal family who barely acknowledged the guard's existence, Meghan had made an effort to connect with the people who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. "Of course, ma'am," James replied. Deciding to trust his instincts for the moment, Meghan smiled gratefully and continued down the hallway. Her footsteps growing fainter as she moved deeper into the East Wing, James watched her disappear around a corner, heading toward a section of the palace that housed private offices and meeting rooms. His radio crackled softly with routine communications from other guards stationed throughout the grounds, but he made no move to report what he had just witnessed. 20 minutes passed in relative silence. James found himself checking his watch more frequently than usual, wondering about the purpose of Meghan's unexpected visit. The East Wing offices were typically used for administrative work and private meetings that required discretion. Several senior palace officials had their offices in that section, including the private secretary to the Queen and various advisors who handled sensitive royal matters. The sound of approaching voices broke James from his thoughts. He could hear at least two people walking back toward his position, their conversation muffled but intense. As they drew closer, James recognized Meghan's voice, but she was speaking with someone whose identity he couldn't determine from their footsteps. "Alone, you have to understand the position this puts everyone in," came a crisp British accent that James immediately recognized as belonging to Sir Edward Bramwell, one of the Queen's most trusted private secretaries. Sir Edward had been with the royal household for over 2 decades and was known for his unwavering loyalty and discretion. "I understand perfectly," Meghan replied, her voice steady but carrying an edge that suggested underlying tension. "But some things are more important than positions and protocols." As they rounded the corner and came into view, James maintained his professional composure while observing the interaction. Sir Edward, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, walked beside Meghan with his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was troubled, and he kept glancing around as if ensuring they weren't being observed. "The timing couldn't be worse," Sir Edward continued, his voice low but audible to James's trained ears. "With everything that's been happening, stirring up old matters could have serious consequences." Meghan stopped walking and turned to face the private secretary directly. James could see her profile and noticed the determined set of her jaw, a look he remembered from her days as a working royal when she was particularly passionate about a cause. "Edward, with all due respect, some secrets have a way of coming out whether we want them to or not," she said firmly. "The question is whether the family chooses to address this proactively or waits for someone else to make that choice for them." Sir Edward removed his glasses and cleaned them nervously, a gesture James had observed during previous tense moments in palace life. The private secretary was known for his calm demeanor, so this display of anxiety was particularly noteworthy. "You're asking me to risk everything I've worked for," Sir Edward said quietly. "My loyalty to the crown has never been questioned in 23 years of service." "I'm not questioning your loyalty," Meghan replied, her voice softening slightly. "I'm asking you to consider what real loyalty looks like when the institution itself might be at risk." The two continued their conversation in hushed tones, moving past James's position toward the main entrance of the East Wing. As they walked away, James caught fragments of their discussion that made his pulse quicken. Words like evidence, protection, and before it's too late drifted back to him, creating a picture of something far more serious than a simple family visit. After they disappeared from view, James remained at his post, his mind racing with questions. What kind of evidence could Meghan have? What was she trying to protect, and from whom? And why was one of the Queen's most trusted advisors so clearly conflicted about whatever she was proposing? The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows through the palace windows, but James felt as though he had stumbled into a mystery that would change everything he thought he knew about the royal family. 3 hours later, James was still processing what he had witnessed when his supervisor, Captain Reynolds, approached with the day's duty rotation. The captain, a stern man with 30 years of royal protection experience, noticed James's distracted demeanor immediately. "Everything all right, Mitchell?" Captain Reynolds asked, his sharp eyes scanning the corridor behind James. "You look like you've seen a ghost." James hesitated, weighing his options carefully. His training emphasized the importance of reporting all unusual activities, but something about Meghan's visit and her conversation with Sir Edward felt too delicate to share without understanding the full context. "Just a quiet morning, sir," James replied, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. Captain Reynolds studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "Right then, I need you to cover the South Gardens this afternoon. Lady Catherine is hosting a charity tea, and we need extra coverage for the grounds." As his supervisor walked away, James felt a mixture of relief and guilt. He had never withheld information from his commanding officers before, but something told him that reporting Meghan's presence might set off a chain of events that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. The afternoon shift in the South Gardens provided James with time to think while maintaining his professional duties. The charity event was proceeding smoothly, with Lady Catherine graciously welcoming guests and posing for photographs with various dignitaries. The familiar routine of royal events helped calm James's nerves, but he couldn't shake the memory of the morning's encounter. As the tea wound down and guests began to depart, James noticed a familiar figure approaching from the direction of the main palace. Sir Edward Bramwell walked across the manicured lawn with purposeful strides, but his usually impeccable appearance showed signs of stress. His tie was slightly askew, and he kept checking his pocket watch nervously. Sir Edward approached James directly, which was unusual given the strict hierarchy of palace staff interactions. Private secretaries typically communicated with guards through their supervisors, maintaining the formal structure that governed royal household operations. "Guard Mitchell," Sir Edward said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "I believe you were stationed in the East Wing this morning?" "Yes, sir," James replied, maintaining his professional tone despite the anxiety building in his chest. I trust that your commitment to discretion extends beyond the standard requirements of your position, Sir Edward continued. His meaning clear despite the diplomatic language. James looked directly into the private secretary's eyes and saw something unexpected. Behind the formal exterior and years of palace protocol training, he detected genuine fear. This wasn't about protecting royal privacy or maintaining institutional dignity. Sir Edward was genuinely worried about something much more serious. "Absolutely, sir," James replied firmly. "My loyalty to the royal family is unwavering." Sir Edward nodded slowly, but James could see that his words hadn't entirely reassured the private secretary. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, Sir Edward spoke again. "There are times, Mitchell, when serving the crown requires making difficult choices about what information to share and when to share it," he said carefully. "Sometimes protecting the institution means allowing certain conversations to remain private until the appropriate time." James understood the subtext immediately. Sir Edward was asking him to keep quiet about Meghan's visit, at least for now. But the private secretary's obvious anxiety suggested that this wasn't simply a matter of routine confidentiality. "I understand completely, sir," James replied, though his mind was filled with new questions about what he had stumbled into. Sir Edward seemed about to say something else when his mobile phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at the screen and his face paled visibly. Without another word to James, he hurried back toward the palace. His phone pressed to his ear. The rest of James's shift passed without incident, but as evening approached, he found himself paying closer attention to the various conversations and activities happening around him. Palace life had always involved a certain level of intrigue and careful diplomatic maneuvering, but today felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to affect everyone from senior staff to junior housekeepers. During his dinner break, James sat in the staff cafeteria listening to the usual mixture of workplace gossip and friendly conversation. But tonight, several topics kept surfacing that caught his attention. Multiple staff members mentioned increased security briefings, unusual meetings among senior advisors, and a general sense that something significant was developing behind the scenes. "Did you hear about the emergency meeting this afternoon?" whispered Sarah, one of the palace communications coordinators. She was speaking to her colleague Emma while they waited in line for coffee. "Which meeting?" Emma replied, clearly confused. "Sir Edward called together all the senior press officers around 4 o'clock. My supervisor said it was about preparing for potential media inquiries, but she looked absolutely terrified when she came back." James felt his pulse quicken. The timing aligned perfectly with Sir Edward's obvious distress during their conversation in the gardens. Whatever Meghan had discussed with the private secretary was serious enough to trigger emergency protocols among the palace's media relations team. "Preparing for what kind of inquiries?" Emma asked, her voice dropping to match Sarah's conspiratorial tone. "Nobody's saying, but there's talk about bringing in additional legal advisors and crisis management specialists. The kind of people they only call when something really big is about to break." James finished his dinner quickly and returned to his evening duties. But the conversation in the cafeteria had confirmed his suspicions. Meghan's visit wasn't a simple family matter or routine discussion about charitable work. She had brought something to Sir Edward's attention that had the potential to create a major crisis for the royal family. As he walked through the palace corridors during his final security rounds, James noticed subtle changes in the building's atmosphere. Additional staff members were working late. Lights were on in offices that typically closed by 6 o'clock. And there was an unusual amount of movement between different wings of the palace near midnight. As James prepared to conclude his shift, he made one final patrol through the East Wing where his day had begun so strangely. The hallways were quiet now, illuminated only by the soft glow of emergency lighting and moonlight streaming through tall windows. As he approached the area where he had last seen Meghan and Sir Edward that morning, James noticed something that made him pause. The door to Sir Edward's office was slightly ajar, and warm light spilled into the corridor. James could hear the faint sound of papers rustling and occasional muted phone conversations, moving closer while maintaining proper protocol. James caught a glimpse of Sir Edward through the partially open door. The private secretary was surrounded by stacks of documents, file folders spread across his usually pristine desk. Even from a distance, James could see the exhaustion in the man's posture and the stress evident in his movements. A phrase from one of Sir Edward's phone conversations drifted into the corridor. "We need to know exactly what she has before we can develop an appropriate response strategy." James felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that whatever Meghan had brought to the palace that morning had set in motion a series of events that would likely change the royal family forever. The next morning brought an unusual flurry of activity to Windsor Castle. James arrived for his shift to find the palace buzzing with preparation for what appeared to be an unscheduled but significant meeting. Staff members moved through the corridors with unusual urgency, and several black sedans with diplomatic plates had arrived during the night. James was assigned to the state dining room corridor, a posting that typically involved monitoring routine administrative meetings. However, the guest list for today's gathering was anything but routine. He recognized several faces from years of royal service: the Queen's principal private secretary, the master of the household, and various senior advisors who rarely convened outside of major state occasions. Exactly 10 o'clock, a convoy of vehicles arrived at the main entrance. James watched through the tall windows as Prince William emerged from the lead car, his expression serious and focused. Behind him, Catherine stepped out with the graceful composure she had perfected over years of royal duties. But James could detect tension in the set of her shoulders. What surprised James most was seeing Prince Harry exit the third vehicle. The younger prince had been largely absent from royal events since relocating to California, and his presence suggested that whatever was unfolding involved the entire family at the highest levels. As the royal family members made their way through the palace, James noted the absence of the usual pleasantries and casual conversation that typically accompanied family gatherings. Today, everyone moved with purpose toward the state dining room, where an emergency family meeting was clearly about to take place. Sir Edward Bramwell appeared at James's side, looking even more haggard than he had the previous evening. The private secretary's usually immaculate appearance showed signs of a sleepless night, and James could see dark circles under his eyes. "Mitchell," Sir Edward said quietly, "I need you to ensure absolute privacy for the next several hours. No staff in this corridor unless specifically summoned, and any inquiries about today's meeting should be directed to me personally." "Understood, sir," James replied, though he was increasingly curious about the nature of the crisis that required such extraordinary secrecy. As the morning progressed, James could hear the muffled sounds of intense conversation from within the state dining room. Voices were raised occasionally, though the thick wooden doors prevented him from distinguishing specific words or speakers. At one point, he heard what sounded like Prince William's voice elevated in frustration, followed by a period of tense silence. Around noon, the dining room doors opened and Meghan emerged, accompanied by a woman James didn't immediately recognize. The stranger was professionally dressed in a dark suit and carried a briefcase that suggested legal expertise. As they walked past James's position, he could see that Meghan's composed exterior was maintained through visible effort. "The documents speak for themselves," Meghan was saying to her companion. "The question now is whether the family chooses to address this proactively, or continues to hope it will simply disappear. You've certainly given them a lot to consider," the other woman replied with what sounded like an American accent. "But you need to be prepared for the possibility that they'll choose institutional protection over individual accountability." James pretended to study his duty roster while straining to hear more of their conversation. The legal advisor, if that's what she was, continued speaking as they moved down the corridor. "The media will eventually uncover this story with or without the family's cooperation. The difference is whether they control the narrative or become victims of it." After they disappeared around the corner, James remained at his post, processing what he had overheard. The implications were staggering. Meghan appeared to have evidence of something significant enough to require emergency family meetings and legal consultation. The phrase individual accountability suggested that someone within the royal family might have engaged in behavior serious enough to require legal protection. The afternoon brought another wave of arrivals. James recognized the distinctive Bentley that belonged to the Queen's legal counsel, followed by 2 additional vehicles carrying what appeared to be crisis management specialists. The parade of advisors suggested that the royal family was preparing for a potential public relations disaster of unprecedented proportions. At 4 o'clock. The state dining room doors opened again, and the royal family members began to emerge. James observed their body language carefully, noting the stark differences in their demeanor compared to their arrival that morning. Prince William appeared exhausted and frustrated, running his hands through his hair as he spoke quietly with Catherine. Their conversation was intense but controlled, suggesting they were trying to process information that had fundamentally altered their understanding of their family situation. Prince Harry walked alone, his expression grim but determined. As he passed James's position, he paused briefly and looked directly at the guard. "Thank you for your service, James," Harry said quietly, using the guard's first name in a way that felt both personal and significant. "Your Royal Highness," James replied with a respectful nod. Surprised to be acknowledged by name, Harry seemed about to say something else, but then thought better of it and continued toward the exit. James watched him leave, wondering if the prince's words carried deeper meaning than simple courtesy. The final person to emerge from the dining room was Meghan herself. She walked slowly, as if carrying an enormous weight, and James could see tear stains on her cheeks despite her efforts to maintain composure. As she approached his position, she stopped and looked directly at him. "James," she said softly, "sometimes protecting the people we care about requires making very difficult choices." Before James could respond, she continued past him and out of the palace. Through the windows, he watched her enter the same vehicle that had brought her legal advisor, and the convoy departed Windsor Castle with the same urgent efficiency with which it had arrived. Sir Edward was the last to leave the state dining room, and his appearance suggested that the day's meetings had been even more challenging than James had imagined. The private secretary's hands trembled slightly as he gathered his papers, and his face had taken on an ashen pallor that spoke of profound stress. "Sir Edward?" James ventured carefully. "Is there anything I can do to assist?" The private secretary looked up sharply, as if he had forgotten James's presence entirely. For a moment, his carefully maintained professional facade cracked, and James saw raw vulnerability in the older man's expression. "Mitchell," Sir Edward said slowly, "in your years of service to this family, you've undoubtedly observed that royal life involves complex balances between public duty and private struggles." James nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading but sensing its importance. "What you witnessed today," Sir Edward continued, "represents one of the most challenging decisions this family has ever faced. The choice between protecting long-held secrets and accepting the consequences of truth." The private secretary gathered his remaining papers and prepared to leave, but he paused at the doorway and turned back to James. "Whatever happens in the coming weeks, remember that good people can make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes have consequences that extend far beyond the individuals involved." With those cryptic words, Sir Edward left James alone in the corridor, surrounded by the echoes of a day that had clearly changed the trajectory of the royal family forever. 2 weeks passed before James fully understood the magnitude of what he had witnessed. The palace had returned to its usual rhythm of scheduled engagements and routine protocols, but beneath the surface, everyone seemed to be waiting for something to happen. Staff members spoke in hushed tones, and there was an underlying tension that even the most junior employees could sense. James was working the morning shift in the Queen's private wing when his radio crackled, with an urgent message from Captain Reynolds. All senior guards were being summoned to an emergency briefing in the security office. As James made his way through the palace corridors, he noticed other staff members moving with unusual purpose, suggesting that whatever was about to unfold would affect the entire household. The security briefing room was packed with personnel from every department. Captain Reynolds stood at the front, his expression more serious than James had ever seen it. Behind him, a large television screen displayed the logo of a major British newspaper, and James felt his stomach drop as he realized what was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Reynolds began, "we have been informed that a significant story regarding the royal family will be published tomorrow morning. This story will likely generate intense media scrutiny and require all of us to maintain the highest levels of professionalism and discretion." James glanced around the room and saw his colleagues exchanging worried glances. Stories that warranted emergency briefings were typically of international importance, involving matters of state security or major constitutional implications. "The details of the story are not yet fully known to us," Captain Reynolds continued, "but we have been advised to prepare for unprecedented media attention and potential security concerns. All leave has been cancelled, and we will be operating under enhanced protocols until further notice." As the briefing concluded and staff members dispersed to their duties, James felt a sense of dread settling in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that the story about to break was directly connected to Meghan's mysterious visit and the emergency family meeting he had witnessed. His suspicions were confirmed the following morning when the news broke across every major media outlet simultaneously. The headlines were devastating in their simplicity and shocking in their implications. James read them on his phone during his early morning patrol, his hands trembling as the full scope of the revelation became clear. The story revealed evidence of a systematic cover-up involving a serious incident from several years earlier. According to the reports, a senior member of the royal family had been involved in a situation that had been concealed through the coordinated efforts of palace officials, legal advisors, and media contacts. The cover-up had allegedly involved the manipulation of witness statements, the suppression of physical evidence, and the intimidation of potential whistleblowers. What made the story particularly explosive was its source. Meghan had provided journalists with documentation that she had discovered during her time as a working royal, evidence that she had apparently tried to address through internal channels before ultimately deciding to go public. The articles detailed her attempts to work with palace officials, including her meeting with Sir Edward Bramwell, and the family's alleged refusal to take appropriate action. James felt physically sick as he read the details. The evidence Meghan had presented was comprehensive and damaging, including photographs, internal memos, and recorded conversations that painted a picture of institutional corruption, extending to the highest levels of the royal household. The story explained her emotional state during her final departure from the palace, and Sir Edward's obvious distress in the days that followed. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. By mid-morning, dozens of news vans had gathered outside the palace gates, and reporters were broadcasting live updates from every angle. The palace press office released a brief statement acknowledging the reports and promising a full investigation, but the damage was already spreading beyond containment. James watched from his duty position as senior palace officials moved through the building in crisis mode. Sir Edward Bramwell had not appeared for work that morning, and rumors circulated among staff that he had tendered his resignation rather than face questioning about his role in the cover-up. Other longtime palace employees seemed to be avoiding public areas, clearly worried about their own potential involvement. Around noon, James witnessed something that would stay with him forever. Prince William arrived at the palace through a side entrance, avoiding the main gates where media were gathered. The future king looked as though he had aged years in the span of days, his face drawn with exhaustion and what appeared to be profound disappointment. As William walked through the corridor where James was stationed, he paused and looked directly at the guard who had witnessed the beginning of this crisis. "James," William said quietly, using the guard's first name in a way that suggested he understood James's unique perspective on recent events. "Your Royal Highness," James replied respectfully, though his heart was racing. "You've served this family with loyalty and discretion for many years," William continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "I want you to know that your professionalism during this difficult period has not gone unnoticed." James sensed that the prince was trying to communicate something beyond simple appreciation. There was an acknowledgement in William's words that suggested he knew James had been aware of the unfolding situation and had handled it with appropriate care. "Thank you, sir," James replied. "My commitment to the royal family remains unchanged." William nodded slowly, but James could see the pain in his eyes. The future king was clearly struggling with the knowledge that someone he trusted had betrayed that trust, and that the institution he would one day inherit had been compromised by the actions of its own members. "Sometimes," William said carefully, "protecting the crown requires making decisions that feel like betrayal to those we care about personally." With those words, William continued down the corridor, leaving James to contemplate the full weight of what the prince had shared. The royal family was clearly fracturing under the pressure of the revelations. Forced to choose between protecting individuals and preserving the institution itself, the afternoon brought news that sent shockwaves through the palace staff. The senior royal at the center of the allegations had been suspended from all official duties pending a full investigation. Legal proceedings were being initiated, and several longtime palace officials had been placed on administrative leave while their involvement was examined. As James concluded his shift that evening, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events he had witnessed. What had begun as an unexpected visit from Meghan had ultimately exposed a web of corruption that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy. The guard, who had simply been doing his job, had found himself at the center of one of the most significant royal scandals in modern history. Walking through the palace corridors that had seemed so stable and permanent just weeks earlier, James realized that nothing would ever be the same. The royal family would survive this crisis, as it had survived others throughout its long history, but the cost would be measured in broken relationships, shattered trust, and the painful recognition that even the most revered institutions are vulnerable to human weakness and moral failure. 6 months after the scandal broke, Windsor Castle had settled into an uneasy new normal. James had been promoted to a senior guard following the departure of several longtime palace employees who had been implicated in the cover-up. His discretion during the crisis had earned him the trust of the new palace administration, though he sometimes wondered if he deserved the recognition for simply doing his job. The royal family had weathered the initial storm, but the damage to their reputation was significant and ongoing. Public opinion polls showed declining support for the monarchy, and several Commonwealth nations had begun serious discussions about constitutional reforms that would reduce the royal family's role in their governments. James was assigned to the state apartments on a crisp October morning when he received word that Meghan would be returning to the palace for the first time since the story broke. The visit had been arranged through legal channels as part of the ongoing investigation, and security protocols had been enhanced to ensure her safety. Given the intense public interest in her role as a whistleblower, the media attention surrounding her arrival was unlike anything James had witnessed in his years of royal service. Hundreds of reporters and photographers lined the approach roads to Windsor Castle, and additional security personnel had been brought in from across the country to manage the crowds. Some members of the public had gathered to show support for Meghan's decision to speak out, while others carried signs criticizing her for exposing royal family secrets. James watched from his position inside the palace as Meghan's convoy approached through a side entrance that had been cleared of media presence. When she stepped out of the armored vehicle, James was struck by how much she had changed in the months since their last encounter. There was a steely determination in her posture that hadn't been present during her emotional departure. After the emergency family meeting, accompanying Meghan were her legal team and what appeared to be investigators from the independent commission that had been established to examine the palace's handling of the original incident. The group moved through the palace corridors with official purpose, heading toward the same conference room where the family crisis meeting had taken place months earlier. As they passed James's position, Meghan caught sight of him and paused. For a moment, her professional composure softened, and James saw traces of the person who had once walked these halls as a working royal. "Hello, James," she said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Ma'am," James replied respectfully, unsure of the proper protocol for addressing someone who had become simultaneously a former royal and a key witness in a major investigation. "I hope you understand why I had to do this," she said. Her words clearly chosen carefully but carrying genuine emotion. James nodded slowly. Over the months since the story broke, he had come to appreciate the impossible position Meghan had found herself in. She had possessed evidence of serious wrongdoing but had been trapped between loyalty to her family and responsibility to hold powerful people accountable for their actions. "Sometimes, doing the right thing requires tremendous personal sacrifice," James replied. Drawing on his years of observing royal duty and public service, Meghan smiled sadly and continued toward the conference room, leaving James to reflect on how much courage it must have taken for her to risk everything for the sake of truth and justice. The meeting lasted for over 4 hours, and James could hear the serious tone of discussions through the heavy doors. Unlike the emotional family meeting months earlier, this gathering was conducted with the formal precision of a legal proceeding. Investigators asked detailed questions, documents were examined and verified, and witness statements were recorded for the official record. When the meeting concluded, the first person to emerge was Sir Edward Bramwell. The former private secretary looked frail and defeated, his career and reputation destroyed by his role in the original cover-up. As he walked past James, the older man paused and looked at the guard with eyes full of regret. "You did well to stay silent when silence was appropriate, Mitchell," Sir Edward said quietly, "and I hope others will learn from my failure to speak up when words were needed." James watched the broken man leave the palace for what would likely be the final time. Carrying the weight of decisions that had cost him everything he had worked for throughout his distinguished career, the investigation team emerged next, their expressions serious but satisfied. James could tell from their body language that the day's proceedings had been productive, likely confirming details that would strengthen their eventual report. The independent commission had been given unprecedented access to palace records and personnel, a transparency that would have been unthinkable before. Meghan's revelations forced the royal family to accept external oversight. Finally, Meghan appeared in the doorway, flanked by her legal advisors. She looked exhausted but relieved, as if a tremendous burden had been lifted from her shoulders. As she prepared to leave the palace, she once again approached James's position. "The truth has a way of surviving even when powerful people try to bury it," she said, her words carrying the weight of someone who had paid a significant personal price for that principle. "Yes, ma'am," James agreed, thinking about all the palace secrets he had observed over the years and wondering how many other important truths remained hidden behind royal protocol and institutional loyalty. "Take care of yourself, James," Meghan added with genuine warmth. "And remember that real loyalty sometimes means protecting institutions from their own worst impulses." As Meghan's convoy departed Windsor Castle, James remained at his post, contemplating the transformation he had witnessed over the past months. The palace around him looked the same, with its ancient walls and priceless artifacts. But everything fundamental about how it operated had changed. The new palace administration had implemented transparency measures that would have been unthinkable before the scandal. Staff members were now required to report suspected wrongdoing through independent channels, and there were regular reviews by external oversight bodies. The changes were designed to ensure that the kind of systematic cover-up that had been exposed could never happen again. Prince William had emerged as the leader of the reform efforts, working tirelessly to rebuild public trust in the monarchy. James had observed the future king's determination to learn from the crisis and create a more accountable institution for the future. It was clear that William understood the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to adapt to modern expectations of transparency and responsibility. As evening fell over Windsor Castle, James concluded his shift with a sense of cautious optimism. The royal family had faced one of the greatest challenges in its modern history, and while the damage was significant, they had ultimately chosen institutional reform over continued secrecy. Meghan's courage in speaking truth to power had forced a reckoning that would benefit the monarchy in the long term. Even if the short-term costs were severe, walking through the palace corridors that had witnessed so much history, James realized he had been privileged to observe a crucial moment in the evolution of one of the world's oldest institutions. The monarchy would emerge from this crisis different than it had been before, hopefully stronger and more worthy of the public trust it sought to maintain. 1 year after Meghan's whistleblowing had shaken the foundations of the British monarchy, James found himself standing in the same East Wing corridor where the entire crisis had begun. The palace had been transformed by the reforms that followed the scandal, and James was now head of palace security, a position created to ensure that the institutional changes would be properly implemented and maintained. The Independent Commission's final report had been published 3 months earlier, delivering scathing conclusions about the culture of secrecy that had enabled the cover-up to persist for years. Several high-ranking officials had faced criminal charges, while others had quietly retired with their reputations permanently damaged. The royal family itself had emerged with their constitutional role intact, but fundamentally changed in how they approached accountability and transparency. James was reviewing the morning's security briefings when his assistant informed him that Prince William had requested a private meeting. The future king had been the driving force behind the palace reforms, working tirelessly to rebuild public trust while managing the personal cost of seeing longtime family associates face legal consequences for their actions. William arrived punctually, looking more relaxed than James had seen him in months. The prince had aged during the crisis, but there was now a sense of purpose in his demeanor that suggested he had found meaning in the painful process of institutional reform. "James," William said as he entered the security office, "I wanted to speak with you personally before the announcement is made public." "Your Royal Highness," James replied, curious about what development might require such discretion. William took a seat across from James's desk, abandoning the formal protocols that typically govern such interactions. The gesture suggested this conversation was more personal than official. "The family has made a decision about Meghan," William said quietly. "We're going to publicly acknowledge that her actions, while painful for us personally, were necessary to protect the integrity of the crown." James felt a surge of surprise. For months, the official palace position had been carefully neutral, neither condemning nor endorsing Meghan's decision to go public with her evidence. A direct acknowledgement of her positive contribution would be unprecedented. The Commission's report made it clear that the cover-up would have continued indefinitely without her intervention. William continued, "We can't claim to support accountability and transparency while refusing to credit the person who made them possible." James nodded, understanding the significance of such an admission. It would represent a fundamental shift in how the royal family approached criticism and dissent, acknowledging that external pressure could serve a valuable function in keeping the institution honest. "There's something else," William added, his expression becoming more personal. "Harry and Meghan will be returning to the UK permanently. They've accepted roles in the reformed palace structure, focusing on modernization and public accountability." The announcement was stunning. James had assumed that the Sussex family's relationship with the rest of the royals had been permanently damaged by the scandal and its aftermath. The decision to bring them back suggested a level of reconciliation that few observers would have thought possible. "Harry will be heading the new Office of Constitutional Accountability," William explained, "while Meghan will lead public engagement reform. They'll be working directly with Parliament and civil society organizations to ensure the monarchy remains relevant and responsible to the British people." James considered the implications of such appointments. Having the very people who had exposed the palace's failures take leadership roles in preventing future problems was a bold statement about the family's commitment to change. It would also send a powerful message to the public about the sincerity of the reform efforts. "And you, James," William continued, "have been instrumental in helping us navigate this transition. Your discretion during the initial crisis and your leadership during the reform process have been invaluable." James felt a mixture of pride and humility. He had simply tried to do his job with integrity during an extraordinary situation. But he appreciated the recognition from someone whose judgment he respected. "There's one more thing I wanted to share with you personally," William said, his voice taking on a more reflective tone. "My grandmother wanted me to convey her gratitude for your service during this difficult period." The mention of the Queen surprised James. Her Majesty had remained largely out of the public eye during the scandal and its aftermath, but her influence behind the scenes had been crucial in ensuring the family chose transparency over self-protection. She specifically mentioned that your handling of Meghan's initial visit demonstrated the kind of judgment and loyalty that the Crown needs in its people, William continued. "You understood that sometimes protecting the institution means allowing uncomfortable truths to emerge." James felt deeply moved by the recognition from the monarch herself. Throughout his career, he had wondered whether his service made any meaningful difference in the larger scope of royal duties and constitutional responsibilities. To know that his actions during the crisis had contributed to positive change was profoundly meaningful. As their meeting concluded, William stood and extended his hand to James in a gesture that transcended typical royal protocol. The handshake between the future king and the palace security chief represented a partnership in building a more accountable and transparent monarchy for the future. "The institution will survive this crisis," William said firmly. "And it will be stronger because people like you chose principle over convenience when it mattered most." After William left, James remained in his office, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought the royal family to this point. Meghan's courage in speaking truth to power had catalyzed changes that would protect the monarchy for generations to come. The painful process of reckoning with institutional failures had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the Crown's relationship with the British people. Looking out the window at the ancient walls of Windsor Castle, James thought about all the secrets these buildings had held over the centuries, and all the moments when individuals had been forced to choose between loyalty to people and loyalty to principles. The decision to prioritize transparency and accountability would ensure that future generations of palace staff would never again face the impossible position of being asked to participate in cover-ups or institutional dishonesty. As evening approached, James made his final security rounds of the day, walking through corridors that had witnessed the unfolding of one of the most significant constitutional crises in modern British history. The palace felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of hidden secrets had been lifted from its ancient stones. In the East Wing, he paused at the exact spot where he had first seen Meghan arriving for her fateful meeting with Sir Edward Bramwell. That moment had seemed like a minor anomaly in the routine of palace life, but it had actually been the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the monarchy for the modern era. James smiled as he remembered Meghan's words during her final visit. "The truth has a way of surviving even when powerful people try to bury it." She had been right, and her willingness to risk everything for the sake of accountability had ultimately saved the institution she was accused of betraying. As he completed his rounds and prepared to end another day in service to the Crown, James felt confident that the reformed monarchy would be worthy of the trust the British people had placed in it for over 1,000 years. The crisis had tested everyone involved, but it had also proven that even the most traditional institutions could evolve and improve when challenged by principled individuals who refused to accept that secrecy and power should be allowed to triumph over truth and justice.